Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, January 29th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about why a major primary challenge to Joe Biden is so unlikely in the 2024 presidential election. Now, for a long time now, I have been glossing over the 2024 primary race for the Democratic nomination. I've been really just talking about how there is Donald Trump and Joe Biden for the general election, and I've sort of just written it off as exactly that. But there's a lot more internal politics that explains exactly why President Biden did not face a formidable primary challenger, and it goes into a variety of different reasons. And so I decided that I would make a video on that, especially as many people have been discussing why has Joe Biden been on the ballot for so long, and why did nobody try to replace him? Now, the first thing that I think we really have to address is the fact that President Joe Biden is the incumbent. As of right now, Joe Biden serves as the 46th president of the United States of America, which means he's on track to potentially run for re-election should he choose to. But it isn't the first time that we've seen considerations about an incumbent president potentially being replaced on the ballot, but often you don't see much conversation around it. The main reason why Joe Biden gets these concerns isn't because of his level of popularity or his level of electability, but more so on the side of his age, as he is now going to be 81 years old in this election season, the oldest president in United States history. And so with this consideration, and this taken into account, many people on the left and the right have argued that Joe Biden should not run for re-election. But he ultimately decided that he would. And so I think that as of right now, the reason we have not seen any major primary opponent to him, at least on the first step of unpacking this very extensive question, is the fact he is the incumbent. And the incumbent always has an advantage. On the second side of things, I think we look no further than the 2024 Democratic presidential primaries. That's because Dean Phillips, a three-term congressman from the state of Minnesota, has announced his bid for the presidency of the United States, and yet has received zero support and zero traction on the national stage. He did do a little bit well in the state of New Hampshire, getting around 19% of the vote, but you have to put in the little asterisk there that Joe Biden wasn't on the ballot here, and the Biden campaign had absolutely no presence in this state. And so in a state where Biden isn't competing, and he's running against a candidate who does have elected office experience, he still gets around 64% of the vote. A very early indicator that, wait a second, Joe Biden still has support in the Democratic Party. Dean Phillips, on the other hand, simply does not. And so to spend very little time talking about him, I think we really don't need to go too much in depth than understanding that Dean Phillips running for this spot has essentially ended his future political aspirations. Anyone who decides to challenge a sitting president, for example, Bill Weld, the former governor of Massachusetts, ran for office back in 2020 against Donald Trump. The reason why he ran was because he felt that he could be a formidable opponent to President Trump. That ended up not being true, and his political career was over. The same thing for Dean Phillips. He's not going to return to Congress. He's not going to return to Minnesota's 3rd District and win another election. And that's because these party primaries are largely about loyalty. That brings me to my second point here. Joe Biden is the incumbent, but being the incumbent inspires a wave of loyalty across your party. Because you have already been elected once, the same voters that elected you the first time realistically would be open to re-electing you a second time. And although President Biden's numbers are not doing so well, on the Democratic side, they are. And the voters here are loyal to him. When you take a look at the 2024 general election matchups, you have to understand that while this may show that President Biden does have not as much support as 2020, you have to look within the primary process to understand that the Democratic electorate is very different than the general election electorate. All we've seen are major headlines. Why aren't Democrats, replacing Biden? He's losing to Trump. Well, you have to ask these Democratic voters here, do they want someone other than the president that they just elected in the past election? And more often than not, that answer is no. When you dive deep into some of the data that looks at presidential approval, you'll often find that the majority of Democrats may say that they don't want President Biden to be, president again, but they still approve of the job that he's doing in the office of President of the United States. Reuters, for instance, is a poll that typically does national headlines between, horse race polling, general election data, generic ballot data, and of course, presidential approval. And they find that 53% of Americans back in December disapproved of the job that Joe Biden was doing as president of the United States. But when you take a look at his approval rating amongst Democrats, it hovers around 77%. Well, when 77% of your core electorate in the Democratic primary is in favor of the president, you often find that they don't want to vote against them. And so even though the majority of Democrats might be saying they don't want President Biden to run again, in the same headline as Forbes reports, they'll probably vote for him anyway. And so it's very interesting, I think, on two ends here. You have a president who is an incumbent who, by that fact, gets a level of, presidential authority, a presidential bump, pretty much treated as the presumptive nominee. And then on the second hand, loyalty is a very big thing. Because let's say Dean Phillips, he wants to return back to public office. The voters in that district might not care as much as the external PACs that will flood into that race to ensure that he is not rewarded for this dissent against President Biden. And this is the same thing on both sides of the aisle. It's not really an alone case to the Democratic Party. This is exactly what happens in presidential primaries, where you have such a significant backing behind one candidate, and then somebody comes out of nowhere and decides to challenge them for a nomination, for whatever it might be, and you'll find that similarly aligned PACs with the frontrunner, in this case Joe Biden, will often go after them in future elections. It's the same thing we've seen with influence of external factors in races, and I could see an argument that the Democratic primary voters in Minnesota's 3rd district are not pleased that rather than having their representative represent them in the district, is deciding to run a long shot bid for the presidency against President Biden. And so again, loyalty to a district is equally important. He goes back home and he ends up losing. And so what I keep thinking about too here is the fact that this candidacy for President Biden was also very much primed. When he announced his bid for the presidency, there was a lot of conversation around it in the mainstream media, on social media, saying, this is unorthodox. Some people even going so far as to saying that President Biden had, declared that he was going to be a one-term president. He never said that. He had never campaigned on that and never really referenced it. The media just took different positions when he was in the transition, when he called himself a transitionatory, president, right? That was taken out of context and said, oh, he's not going to run for re-election. And yet in 2022, when the First Lady and when many other people close to President Biden were saying constantly, it's his intention to run. This press secretary was saying it's his intention to run. President Biden himself saying it's his intention to run. The First Lady saying Biden is ready to run. I want him to run for re-election. All these articles populating, yet nobody's paying attention until he actually does it. But who is paying attention? Those long list of Democrats that eventually want to run in 2028, for instance. People like Pete Buttigieg, Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer. I'm sure for a long time now, Vice President Harris has known that President Biden always intended on running for re-election. And so you have to look at it from that lens too, that these candidates, these potential, stars of the Democratic Party that might be able to win a general election, were primed in the fact that President Biden is going to run for re-election. And so now that we're moving full force ahead into the primary season, there was less of an incentive for them to get into the race as well. And I think many of them are focused on 2028 and not 2024. Because again, they don't want to be like Dean Phillips and have no political future because they decided to run for president a little too early. It reminds me a lot of Ron DeSantis, who did see a lot of voters punishing him for his disloyalty to people like Donald Trump because he decided to run against him in the presidential primary. I mean, these are real factors that voters, that super PACs, that other members of your elected constituency think about and will hold against you if you decide to run in the future. And so I think looking at the 2024 Democratic presidential primary, you have Joe Biden, who has a lot of major endorsements. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. You can see here that everyone is backing him, so you don't want to be the odd one out. I think the other thing we have to consider too, besides the fact of incumbency, besides the fact of loyalty, besides the fact that this has been a primed race, is also that Democrats don't want to lose again. You see, in 2016, when they nominated Hillary Clinton, she was a shoo-in for the Democratic nomination. There was a point in time where the race got exceptionally close, but by the end of it, we generally knew who was going to win and could have predicted that 4 years prior. But it wasn't that I'm focused on here. The primary is one thing, but the general election, Hillary Clinton faced off against President Donald Trump. At the time, he was a businessman with no electoral incumbency advantage. In fact, Hillary Clinton was treated largely as this return to Obama era incumbent. And when she won the nomination, it was to no one's surprise. But the general election was a huge surprise. And so I think now that Democrats have won a race with Joe Biden at the top of the ticket and also two races with Joe Biden at the bottom of the ticket, they are more likely to bet on what has worked than take a chance on something that hasn't. And I think looking at where we are in this upcoming election, although the numbers don't look so good, there is still a cap here for Donald Trump when he's faced off against Biden. That doesn't exist between Biden and DeSantis, and certainly doesn't exist between Biden and Haley, with her often getting above 50% of the polls in some of the very early on races when there was consideration of this replacement for President Biden. I think as we also look ahead to the 2028 election season, we have to take into account that, we are looking at a core group of people here who do have political futures that do not want to sacrifice it this time around. I do believe that if any of them decided that they were running for president, they would do much better than Dean Phillips. Maybe even came a lot closer in New Hampshire the same way Nikki Haley did against President Trump. But it's too much of a risk. Politicians are risk averse. When they know that this race is going to go one way, there's no reason to enter it trying to narrow it up. And they all know what is at stake in this upcoming election. Because when they look back to 2020 and everything that has followed, whether the insurrection, whether the election denialism, whether the court proceedings, whether the 22 midterms, whether Dobbs v. Jackson, there is a lot on the line here for the Democratic Party. And these risks upon risks upon risks that could ruin someone's political future. They've made no indication that they want to sacrifice a future presidential bid in the hopes they might get this one. Because at the end of the day, President Biden is still popular amongst his core group, which makes it very difficult for us to go and say, this is why Trump versus Biden are going to lose, because the majority of Americans don't want them. When you look down at who's voting, often the most polarized and the most engaged in a party, Democrats, for instance, here, you find that they are often the most loyal to President Biden and the most in favor, especially if they approve of him, as the overwhelming majority of Democrats do. And so looking at the 2024 election cycle, while it may seem to be very easy to sort of tell us, Trump versus Biden, how in the world did we get back here? You have to look no further than a variety of things. Nobody wants to run because nobody really can win. And yet there is this consistent idea that is permeated through every space that we've talked about this election cycle that seems to suggest that there could be replacements to either of them in this election. But we know deep down, and I'm sure they do too, despite spouting this rhetoric on Fox News, on CNN, on MSNBC, that it's going to be Trump versus Biden again. And despite the majority of Americans not wanting that, that is our reality. So when I look to 2024 and you guys ask me, or people ask me, how in the world did Biden win the nomination again? It's for a variety of reasons, many of which are touched on in this video. And of course, there's more at play than what I've discussed. I think at the end of the day, President Biden as the incumbent serves to be a very formidable candidate in this race, especially with the fact that his wife, Dr. Biden, also wants him to be in this race as well. When you are supported by your family and you are supported by your party, there is no indication that you should retire. Age is one thing, but what Joe Biden believes he can do for this country and what it leads him to running in this race and what he believes that can do is above all else. The same reason why Donald Trump is back in the race, the same reason why candidates return to this possibility of running. Because once you do it once and once you win once, as Donald Trump and Joe Biden can tell you, you never want to stop doing it again. And so you run, you run, you run. This is Joe Biden's fourth time running for the presidency, and he could do very well He might lose, time will tell on that general election front, but it makes a lot of sense when you put things back into perspective, you dive a little bit deeper into Democratic Party politics, into just general politics overall, and you understand more and more about why President Biden hasn't faced a significant primary challenger and why Dean Phillips, at the end of the day, has practically ruined his political career for challenging, arguably, a popular Democrat amongst his party in a 2024 election cycle, especially an election cycle as contentious and important as this one. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.